then, so I'll just briefly introduce you, Jessica. I'm sure that you have more, but so everybody, this is Jessica Roadman. She is the outreach coordinator, and she's a community organizer for Crossroads Urban Center. Sorry if I just blasted you there.
No.
And so I'll mute myself now so that we can go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to try it again without the headphones. I'm just speaking more loudly. Is that better and not as muffled? Okay, cool. I'm going to shut my door so I don't blast everyone else with my yelling. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Like I said, I've been with Crossroads for about 4 years. I started just doing community outreach, and then I finished a graduate degree in community leadership a couple of years ago, and had the opportunity to take over the facilitation of one of our projects, one of our organizing projects. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and it's a lot of sort of me sharing, but please feel free to, oh yeah, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do it so I can share it and still see the Zoom window. I mean, share my PowerPoint. Maybe. Oh, we'll just maybe have to go slide by slide. Because I don't know if I can click to present it and still see you all. No, that's not the one anyway. No, I've lost it. Sorry, give me just 1 second. Somehow I managed to lose. Okay, can I make this smaller? We'll just roll with it this way if that's okay. You'll just be able to see the upcoming slides, little teasers. Okay. So primarily, I'm going to share with you a little bit about our history with organizing in general, but then more specifically what I have come to learn and be able to practice with my organizing. And I don't know what your system of questions is, but feel free to jump in with questions at any time. There we go, that worked. Maybe. Oh, cool. So I want to give you a little rundown. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Crossroads, with what we do, but we run 2 emergency food pantries and a clothing distribution store. So we work on our direct service on one hand, and we have an even split sort of down the middle, and we do our policy work on the other end. So in our food pantry, we offer obviously food, other emergency services like rental assistance, utility assistance, diapers, formula, hygiene stuff, gasoline vouchers, prescription vouchers, a variety of different services. And then on our organizing side, we have some people who are advocates. I don't know, have y'all talked about the difference between advocacy and organizing? I apologize if any of this is duplicative for you, but advocacy is more like I'm going to go and speak on behalf of someone else. Organizing is we're bringing people together to speak on behalf of themselves. So we have some people who work pretty much primarily in advocacy, and we have people who work in organizing. So I'm going to focus on the organizing. But the reason I wanted to share that we do both, the reason it's important for all of us who work there, in terms of how we believe it works the best for us, is both of these things inform each other, right? So we listen as people are coming into the food pantry and into our clothing distribution center, and we try to see what the patterns, what patterns are sort of coming up that we're hearing quite a lot of, and then we allow that to inform our advocacy and our organizing. So for example, several years ago in the early 2000s, we found that a number of people who were coming in had lost their food stamps because the food stamp application process or renewal process required such a lengthy, it was just such a lengthy process. It was like a 40-page renewal application. You had to provide documentation that some people weren't able to provide. And so we ended up engaging in a direct action with the city, bringing together a group of policymakers who had power over the food stamp renewal application, a renewal form. And we had them like we timed them to see how long it took them to fill out different states' food stamp renewal forms. And what it proved was that it took everyone the longest to do Utah. And so pretty quickly they realized it wasn't the most effective way to get people the benefits they needed, and so that was changed on the policy level. And vice versa, when we're doing organizing, sometimes we see issues come up that would be beneficial to have as a direct service. So for example, right now, like prior to COVID, we were starting to see more and more people living in their cars. And so when people were not able to make their car payment, they were losing the place that they lived. And so we didn't get a chance to implement it, but we're still talking about maybe rolling into some of our direct services, having assistance with car payment, which we've never done before. So for us, these two parts of our work are completely intertwined. They look separate from the outside, but internally they completely inform one another. Well, any questions at this point before I get into the community organizing? I don't know if the best way is to put it in chat or what. I don't know if I can see the chat. Okay, cool. So a couple of different forms of community organizing. Again, I apologize if this is duplicative in any way, but I wanted to give you some context for the way that we engage in organizing, because like most things, there are different ways to do it and different organizations do it differently. For us, the overarching philosophy of organizing is that the people who have experiences know the best way to address the issues that they've faced. When you've experienced something in your body, in your life, you know it intimately in a way that no one else ever could, and so you know what would have been helpful in that situation. So several different types of organizing. One is institutional organizing or neighborhood organizing. That would be organizing, like obviously within a neighborhood. It could be organizing within a corporation, so some sort of like pre-union work. It could be tenant-based organizing, so everyone is living in the same building. That's a pretty bounded type of organizing. It's really important. And none of these are totally mutually exclusive, but generally like the organizing takes one of these approaches primarily and the other kind of fall into it, can roll into it a little bit. The second type is issue-based organizing. So we see that a lot in direct action. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but this is when you have an issue that people are really fired up about and you find people to work with you on this issue. A third is faith-based organizing. It's just what it sounds like, taking lots of different faith communities and bringing them together. And generally, there is a history of really strong faith-based organizing, and they work on different issues. It just works a little bit differently. It tends to be sort of chapter-based. So different faith communities will work on different things, and then they collaborate on certain larger issues. The way that we run our organizing projects, for a variety of reasons, is called relational organizing. So it focuses primarily and very, very firstly on relationships. Issues, campaigns, bringing new people in all comes after the relationship building. We didn't like select this. We didn't like look at these different types and say like, oh, this one's the one we feel like will work best. It just sort of happened organically. We're a small organization. We're talking to people because we have this direct service component. And so it ended up just making the most sense to focus relationally. So I'm going to talk more about what that looks like in the context I work in just a minute. I wanted to give you a little history of the way that we've done these other types of organizing at Crossroads. We do occasionally do issue-based organizing. It's less of a focus for us. Generally, issue-based organizing comes out of, or appears when an issue has already gotten to a critical point. So most often, this is the type of organizing you're seeing in the world, because it takes a lot of back-end work, but it often escalates to direct action very, very quickly because the issue is already critical. And that's why people have come together on it. So this was several years ago. This is our Coalition of Religious Communities. So this is one where it was an issue-based and also faith-based organizing. And they came together and did a die-in. So before Medicaid was expanded, a bunch of clergy and lay people came together and did a die-in in front of the governor's mansion. So they took a certain number of people and had a certain number of people lie down to represent the number of people who die every year as a direct result of not having expanded Medicaid. So we have that now, but In the 1970s, Crossroads board made it or decided to roll it into our mission that advocacy would be always a part of our organization. So before that, it had just happened. We grew out of our history lent itself to doing this type of work. And in the 70s, our board said, this is important enough that this is going to be part of our mission statement. And that's where Coalition of Religious Communities grew out of that first. Yeah, so that's some issue-based organizing we've done. We did it again in Medicaid expansion when it was expanded and then revoked for a period of time, or threatened to be revoked. So yeah, but that tends to be the more visual type. This is just another demonstration of issue-based organizing. Did a big press conference. So again, it's very powerful visually. You usually bring in color. But generally, these people are working together just on that issue. And then it either rolls into a new issue or more often than not sort of disbands. So sorry, I'm like slightly delayed. We primarily, most often, as I mentioned, we do relational organizing. This is one of our groups, Poplar Grove Neighborhood Alliance. It is relational, and it is also a neighborhood-based group. So they bring together exactly what it sounds like, members of the Poplar Grove community, which is on the west side of the city, a place where they are pretty short on resources in general. And so there was a lot of momentum and energy to bring people together. It's one of the challenges of this type of organizing is that people, are living separately. And so it's hard sometimes to get people to come to any type of meeting, especially when their lives are really full of struggle often. Anyway, we'll talk more about that later. One of the advantages of this type of organizing is people already have buy-in. Very few people can say no when the result is going to be a place that they want to live in. So the group that I help facilitate is called Powerful Moms Who Cares. We are a group of low-income women who are working just more sort of broadly towards safer communities for healthier families, especially for people in poverty. As you can see, this is very relational. It's not specific to one geography. It's a pretty broad mission. This is our mission statement. We still have some parameters around what we work on, but it's much more broad than issue-based or neighborhood-based organizing. Any questions up to this point? I guess just like pop them into the chat and just let me know if any come up because I can't see the chat for some reason. Keep skipping. I'm checking on my other computer to make sure. I think there's a little bit of a delay. So what we work on primarily in our group is crime prevention and safety, childcare, and housing. We came to this decision in a variety of ways, and it's constantly flowing and changing. But these are our primary goals, the primary areas we work. Just to speak a little more specifically about how our organizing works, how relational organizing works, is our first contact generally with folks that we are working to recruit. We still have a recruitment strategy. It's not just totally open and we're just hoping that people are interested in the work we do. Sometimes relational organizing, or often in my experience, it's actually more difficult to recruit because you don't have one issue you're working on that someone can get fired up about. You're not working in their, you are working in their community, but you're not exclusively working in their community. It's a constant balance of gathering information and shifting issues as it relates to the people who are joining you, and also finding new people to join the issues you're already working on. So the way we primarily do that recruitment is through some sort of personal communication. So we often do surveys. We go out to places where we know that people who might be interested in our group are congregating already pre-COVID, right? Like WIC offices, food stamps offices, food pantries, so it's convenient for us that we have the food pantry. And we do surveys. The reason we do that is we, one, want to get to know them. We want them to know that somebody cares about the issues they care about. And we want to make sure the work that we're doing actually resonates. We don't want to be working on an issue for so long that it actually in some way has resolved itself, and then we're just doing work for the sake of doing work. We want to be very, very connected to the community. The second way we reach out to people is through personal connections. This is one that happens more often even than surveys, is that people are in therapy groups or they are existing in other spaces where the population we work with is congregating, and so they just say, hey, come to a meeting. You're interested in bullying in schools. We're talking about that next week. Why don't you come join us? And we have different levels of membership, which I'll talk about in a minute. But as we're doing that recruitment, we still have parameters. So even though we have relational organizing tends to be broader, we still want to get stuff done. And so we can't just say, we're going to take on every issue in the world, because that would take forever. We'd have lots of different people. We wouldn't really be able to make any sort of targeted work. And it also allows us to have a specific type of power we're drawing on. So we are a group of low-income women. And so for us, that's a really big tool in terms of recruitment, right? We're creating these places where women can find empowerment, find voices that sometimes, especially for our low-income population, they're often fed the narrative and internalized the narrative that their voice doesn't matter. And so by bringing together low-income people and low-income women, we are creating a space that gives them a specific type of power, right? And we use that power in a specific type of way. If you have more questions on that, you can ask me later. I'm not going to get too much into it, but because it's a balancing act. Yeah, so that's how we focus our recruitment. We're looking specifically for low-income women. We do, in our meetings, depending on the issue, we may open it up, right? So this is where we talk about different types of memberships. So we then, after this, we have group or newcomer events to sort of bring those people back in with us. And then we host our regular meetings, which happen every week. We focus on a different issue. Often we'll be preparing for specific things. Like I'm going to talk more about specific issues we work on, or one example later. But sometimes when we're working on an issue where it would be beneficial to have more voices, we'll welcome other genders into the group. Or people who aren't moms but are low-income women into the group to work on a specific issue and build the power. So we have membership. A member is someone who comes to, we have bylaws because that's, it's helpful in terms of structuring and also in terms of becoming a 501c3, which is the eventual goal. You have to have bylaws. But mostly we made them because it's helpful for structuring. So you come to a specific number of meetings, you become an active member, and that gives you the power to vote on certain larger issues, whether or not we're going to take on a specific issue. People are welcome to just come when they want, and not in terms of the meeting time, but, well, they are, but people can come to some meetings if they're particularly excited about a particular issue or a presentation we're working on, and then not come for a period of time. The reason we don't allow those people to vote is because you're sort of behind, right? Like we would like our votes to be most informed, which means you've sort of like been appraised and been a part of the conversations as we go along leading up to a certain vote. Right? And then we have not gotten to this point yet because we're a pretty new organization, but eventually we'd like to we're gathering membership for people to mobilize with us. So organizing is the back end side. Mobilization is when you do a big direct issue, right? These are the things we see, the rallies, the marches. You don't need to be a member. You don't ever have to come to a meeting. You just have to be interested in our cause, and we want you there because the power of that type of action is numbers. In order to sort of blend those, to continue recruiting to active membership, we do things that are called one-on-ones. Talked about one-on-ones before. So in addition to the regular meetings, we have check-ins with our active members as often as we can. This has actually been an interesting opportunity as COVID is happening. We're able to do them virtually because there are some internet providers that are offering free internet. So before, we weren't really able to do them virtually at all because most of our population didn't have access to the internet. And so now they do. And so we're taking this time of separation to really reach out and say, like, let's talk one-on-one. And mostly what we're doing is finding out where they are in their life. We're not worrying too much about specific issues, specific campaigns. We are just connecting as two humans who are going through a really, really challenging and traumatic time in life and in the history of the world, the history of our lifetimes anyway. So you basically just chat and then gather the information. We're using it secondarily to gather information. So what resources are more difficult to come by right now for folks in our group? What issues are there with online schooling, a variety of different things. And so we'll take that back and then maybe be able to organize around getting some of those processes changed. In addition to all of that, we do lots of presentations for a variety of reasons. So I'll talk about those. I'll talk about the issue-based presentations later, but we also have the leaders of our group doing presentations for outreach. So it is much more powerful for someone from our group to go out to a group of people and say, this is what we do, this is what it's meant in my life, than for me to go out and say it. I am not part of the population that I organize, which is a barrier. But it happens pretty often. I have some space and privilege in my life that allows me to do the back end organizing work. So most of that work is work done by the leaders of the group. Okay. Things that hopefully this is helpful, wanted to talk about a little bit is what is the role of the organizer then? Because this is always the balance of organizing, particularly as someone who's not a member of the group, or I'm not a member of the population, I'm a member of our organizing group. But, right? I'm not a mom, I'm not low income, I've never had experience living in poverty. I have lots of experience in direct service, working with folks who are low income, but I have not been low income myself. So the balance is always, how much, then what do I do? What's my role? And I have a co-organizer as well. Mostly we are there to be listeners, to be really, really active listeners, to weed through, sort of peel apart what is being said and what is not being said in terms of issue cutting, which I will talk about in a minute, but also leadership development. So if you have been told your whole life you have no role in making policy, you don't just wake up or join a group and say, actually, I guess I could be part of the political system or whatever system we're talking about where we need change happening. Okay, I can be part of this broader change. It's incremental to start to see that. You have to start to feel it first in your body that you have, generally what I'm finding and what organizing believes is that you have to get in the practice of it and you have to feel the power of being able to make change before you can jump into it. So it's sort of like a chicken egg situation. So our role as the organizer is to figure out where people are in that process, to synthesize the data, so do the really boring stuff when we're doing surveys. How do we're not going to ask our leaders to like crunch the data unless they're really excited about it. Our group is pretty small, so they don't have that capacity at this moment. And then to figure out where leadership development is needed. So for example, we had some hesitation around some of the larger speaking engagements that we've had to do. And people were just, instead of saying I'm uncomfortable speaking, a lot of what was coming up sort of like, oh, I'm busy, I can't do it. And in some cases that's true. But part of our role is to listen really carefully and engage in follow-up conversations to figure out, are they really busy or is this because they're not comfortable public speaking? And then if it's the latter, how do we provide the tools for them? So do we do a public speaking training? Do we have one person do it and have the other people watch and see sort of how it goes, how it flows, and that sort of thing. So really reading between the lines. Any questions at the moment? It's just delayed in its movement, but so now we're going to talk a little bit about like what does this look like then, right? That's a lot about the structure, leadership development. We do actually have a board for Powerful Moms Who Care, so that we have people who can make final decisions if anything. Nothing has come up so far that's contentious, but just in case it does. It seems to be frozen. Let me pull this up again. I think it closed itself. Nope, here we go. Okay. On to the next one, and then I'm going to share my screen again. Technology. There we go. I do wonder if ever in like all of our lives of virtual meetings, there will ever be one meeting where the technology just goes totally smoothly. They haven't had one yet. Okay, so what do we do with an issue then, right? Because that's the whole point. Relational organizing is our primary organizing model. But if we're not doing anything, we're not just a support group, we're not coming together to just chat. We do have an element of that, absolutely. But we're moving towards making issue changes. So our goals, one of our goals, and this is when I'm going to talk about the specifics, is that we're working in housing. So right now, all of our members live in one particular housing unit. We're working on expanding that, but they live in the permanent supportive housing unit called Palmer Court. It's on State Street in 1000 South. If you ever drive by there, take a look. It used to be a hotel, so it looks like a hotel, but it was repurposed for this. There are lots and lots of issues there. One of the issues was we found out that the police, just in conversation, right, in relational conversation, the police were not responding to calls from the residents. So the response time was very, very long, like much longer than what we thought were in other parts of the city. What we would assume other parts of the city would find to be acceptable. And two, we found out that almost all of our members had experienced some sort of violent or sexual assault in the building, and that the responding officer refused to take a police report. Now that's like pretty egregious, right? That's pretty clear that the police officers should be taking reports when they are being called for an assault. For anything, but particularly an assault. So this came up and we were like, okay, what do we do first? First, we have to see if it's a pattern, right? Because we're a fairly robust group, but it may just be we happen to have people who have come together on this issue or have come together and all just happen to have this in common. Unlikely when there are that many cases, but so we did some relational, external to the group chatting with other people who lived in the building, and we found that this was in fact a pattern. So the second part of our research was what has been done on this before. So we went to management. We found out there had been some resident groups scheduled, like resident focus groups scheduled about this, and attendance had been really low, organized by management. And then we also found out that the management is in regular conversation with the police department around 911 calls. Part of the issue with the response is that there are many 911 calls because there are many people suffering from mental health crises that bring up some paranoia. And so some of the calls were unfounded, quote unquote unfounded, right? Let's get into that. But so then we revisit the issue and we say, okay, given this new information, what are we going to do about it? It's still a problem, right? It doesn't matter. Maybe the response time is not the direction that we want to go in right now because the management is already working on it. They're already doing that. The residents, we found them, then we talked to residents, right? And we found out that the residents didn't attend the group because it's run by management. And they have issues with management. There are some other problems that layer onto this that tell them we don't feel safe sharing our concerns with management. And so we decided that what we needed to do was have a meeting with the police department. We looked at who has the power, and the person with the main power to make change, right, is the chief of police. So we started with the chief of police, and we had the opportunity to meet with the executive, I forget what her title is, but the executive assistant basically to the chief of police. How I cannot get it to me. There we go. So then what do we do? So our approach as a group, we prefer collaborative approaches first. So some groups jump right into direct action. That's just sort of their MO. It works the best with the personalities that are in their group. They're sort of much more forward. Our group is forward in sort of a backseat way. So we like to have meetings and then demand follow-ups. So this is part of the learning curve, is how do you facilitate a meeting with someone who has power and not let them take the meeting over. And that's part of it. That's difficult for most of us. let alone if you've never been invited to the table where power is happening. That's a huge thing to learn. So we're still working on that. But in that particular case, we did meet with the sergeant who was in charge of the area, and we met with the executive assistant to the chief of police. We expressed our concerns, and in the end, basically actually what happened is they victim blamed. They said that the residents, it was their responsibility to call a second officer when they've been assaulted. That's not a thing, right? That shouldn't happen. First of all, when you're traumatized from the assault, this happened to several of them when they were in the hospital. Like, that's the level of assault we're talking about. And that, you know, the police are overworked, they're not able to respond. There was just a lot that we suggested. Maybe we could offer suggestions for a bias training. Their answer was, we don't have time. So not a lot came out of that. So then what do? You escalate. So our escalation went back and we thought, okay, who has the power over the police department? In Salt Lake City, it's the mayor's office. So we had a meeting with the mayor's office. We got a little bit more direct action response. We got some promises, but the promises were wrapped up in actions that we had to take first that we felt like were unnecessary. So they're like, you need to follow up and do all of these things in terms of documentation, which we had already had quite a lot of documentation. We had proof that this was actually happening. But they were saying we need to do some synthesis of data that actually really was just skirting the issue. So we have had to put that on hold because we've had some other more exciting stuff happening that I'll talk about that has been taking up our time. But what our next step of escalation would be a direct action, right? So you're talking about publicity, you're talking about media, you're talking about targeted campaigns related to elected officials, right? So if an elected official is refusing to take a very strong step in the direction that you want, there is a way to put pressure on elected officials that you can't put on people who aren't elected. But because the chain of command there goes to the mayor's office, and this was with our no judgment and no commentary around like the last mayor we had in general. We had also some really great experiences with that office. Police activity is a really, really big issue. And so, yeah, this has no judgment on the mayor herself. And now this is a new administration and we haven't met with her yet. But a way to get action done is to target elected officials, not violently, target them with political pressure, right, with their constituents, and to collaborate. So we're starting to see, we are totally nonviolent in our work. We actually believe in like some restorative justice. But we also are finding that for this particular issue, probably we're going to need to come together with other groups who are working on police bias and police violence. Because when you get to those higher levels of escalation, you are now sort of drawing in more of a public issue. And so it's helpful to have a broader set of things to be asking for. Still targeted, but not specific to one population. Discussing just sort of the broader issue of police violence with specific asks. So to do that, we'd have to collaborate with other groups who are working specifically on police violence. The way I like to think about the work that we do, almost done, is through concentric circles. I am like a huge concentric circle fan because if you've done any research or any work with systems thinking, everything is embedded into each other. All of the work that we do is in a fluid conversation with the other parts of what we do. So that is that would be what I just talked about, would be our issues relating to that second level of the concentric circle. Inside the building, we're also working on security around, just security in general. So if there's a way to get a police officer who has mental health credentials, who can do, I never remember what it's called in Utah. In California, it's called a 5150, where you put someone on a mandatory 72-hour hold in the hospital if they're threatening themselves. Because one of the things we're finding, right, with this second level is we realize that another issue with the response time delay is that folks who are being threatening, often by the time the police get there, are no longer being threatening, and so the police can't do anything about it. And the security cameras have lots of issues there. And so we're sort of working on all of that as well as part of embedded in that issue. On a broader issue, what has been pretty exciting for us is we're also working on the systems level housing stuff, right? So I mentioned Palmer Court is a remodeled hotel, really cool in terms of environmental awareness, right? We didn't tear it down and just put all of that waste in the landfill and rebuild. But one of the challenges of that building is that a hotel is meant to have as many entrances and exits as possible for the convenience of guests. What happens when you're taking a population who pretty much, what it was designed to do was to take folks basically coming off the street or in straight from the shelter and give them housing, which is awesome. But it also means that you have 250 people who have pretty severe mental health issues, for lack of a better word, untreated mental health conditions, and substance abuse together with some folks who don't. But it creates a really, really unstable situation. There's no way to sort of channel all of the traffic into one space. We're also talking about people in particular, our women. All of them came as survivors of domestic violence. And so there's a huge problem when people can come in the back door. That's very, very unsafe for them. And there's not really much that can be done about it at this point, just because of the literal layout of the building. That type of a situation is fine and needed. But when you have folks who have been there 7, 8, 9 years and have stabilized their lives, they need somewhere else to go. And the reality of our market right now is that we don't really have anything affordable, right? Things might be changing pretty quickly and pretty soon. But generally speaking, there isn't somewhere for someone who is still low income. There's nothing that's what we call deeply subsidized. So at Palmer Court, there's rent forgiveness. There is like the rent is on a sliding scale that's pretty kind and generous. It takes more into account than like Section 8 or some of the other sliding scale or affordable housing units. And so there's just basically nowhere for people to go. There's nowhere for people to leave. And so what we're working on is getting a new permanent supportive housing unit built for families specifically. A permanent supportive housing unit also includes case management. And so to get into Palmer Court, you don't have to have a mental or physical health condition, but it puts you on the top of the wait list. And so for most of the women, the thought of losing case management, even though they have therapists separately, the thought of losing that is really quite scary. There are things like transportation, childcare, stuff that's provided in a permanent supportive housing system that if they were to leave would like exponentially increase their expenses to a level that even if they could find an affordable unit, those extra expenses would break the bank for them. So we were really excited that we were able to build a partnership with Housing Connect, which is the County Housing Authority of Salt Lake, the Housing Authority of the County of Salt Lake, excuse me. And the women in our group did a presentation for their board of directors. They were in the process of building a new unit or a new building that would have 30% deeply subsidized units. And we did a presentation pitch to them that those units should be specifically designated for families. And because it's 30% of the building, they can get federal funding to have case management on site. And they came back and said that they would do that with us and that they have asked us to be their advisory council as they build that building because of the problems in many ways at Palmer Court. The county has they run other permanent supportive housing units, so they know quite a lot already, but they want the women in our group to be involved in this works, this doesn't work, this would be helpful. So that's pretty exciting because what that means is we've got more affordable units in a safer, that we are coming to with the intentionality of safety for families. So we're working on that. That should hopefully be on board, of course, as housing goes, like in the next 2 years. The first phase was purchasing the land, and that should be done here in April. Of course, things are changing quite rapidly with COVID. So yeah, how we cut an issue. Things I'm just going to talk about are some of the challenges and also some of the importance. Before that, I apologize, I've just been talking so much, but any questions, thoughts you want to share We just have these last two things to talk about, but they're sort of a switch back away from what we actually do and issues back into sort of organizing from a, what is it called, 400 foot, 5,000 foot level. I don't remember the question. Questions, thoughts? So organizing is wonderful. It is complex. As you can see, like all of the concentric circles inform one another and they're like constantly moving, right? So it's sort of like concentric circles that are like bouncing around in space and also bleeding into and out of one another. That makes it really challenging to get anything done. So as that is just one issue we're working on, which highlights the importance of focusing on issues. How do you prioritize? How do you choose issues? For us, that comes out of lots and lots and lots of conversation. What it sounds like in practice is lots and lots and lots of complaining, which is a really important part of moving from you have no power to having to understanding how much power you have. Right? Is that you have to dig really deep into the really hard spaces in your life. And so that's, yeah, they just sort of, for us, organically bubble to the surface. And generally, because we live in a connected world, usually the issues connect in some way. But it's an important part, and it's part of why we have bylaws as well, is that it's important as you come into more structure in your group, even though we have a very, very horizontal structure, it's important to have a process in place to make those decisions, because sometimes something comes up that seems really connected, but it might not be in the best interest of the group to spend lots of energy and lots of time there. And someone has to make that decision. So that's why we have voting members. Relational organizing, as you've probably gathered, is extremely time intensive. It's lots and lots of one-on-ones. It is lots and lots of pulling apart pieces. It is lots and lots of connecting to political power, to finding, to doing research. That's one of our challenges. We have a group of about 20, and it's a lot of work. We have one 30-hour-a-week staff member on this project, and myself. I've been with the project since the beginning, and I get to spend about 8 hours a week on it. Our other staff, we got a really exciting grant for this project, and so we were able to hire her recently. Things have really, really shifted for us given COVID. So both of our time has to be taken up with direct service right now. But it's really time intensive, right? You can't just like it's not a domino effect with relational organizing. It is hitting one domino at a time and then going back and standing them all up and then hitting them down again. Another interesting complexity that I had not sort of anticipated was interpersonal dynamics. So we actually brought on an MSW capstone student with the University of Denver to be an intern with us this semester, specifically working on interpersonal dynamics, because the more people you have, it's exciting, you get more power, but the more conflicting personalities you have. And when you're talking about the hard things in your life, it's really hard. It already sort of brings up, not sort of, but it already brings up often sources. Often we're talking about traumatic events in people's lives, right? And so it's bringing up all of that comes with it. And then if someone else has had an experience different than yours and then doesn't agree with your solution and has a personality that sort of already conflicts with yours, it can create a really problematic dynamic. You don't get a lot done, you get stuck there. And so navigating that is an interesting part of being an organizer. You're not just doing the issue work in relational organizing, you're doing the relational part, not just between you and the group, but among group members. And so we're working on that. If you're ever interested in talking about it at some point, we are working on somatic experiencing. That mostly has been applied to one-on-one counseling around PTSD. I am working with a couple of places. Part of my area of interest is doing research on what that looks like in terms of growing political power. It's called generative somatics or politicized somatics. I'm doing research on that. That's sort of like across the board, I think. When I talk to our other organizers and other organizers around the country, these are things that are common complexities. Something that's specifically difficult in relational organizing that has a population that is vulnerable. So in neighborhood organizing and faith-based organizing and issue organizing, you're probably going to have a variety of backgrounds. You're having a variety of classes, which means you have people who have a variety of different time and levels of education on in their background. In organizing with a vulnerable population, we face things like the balance of addressing individual needs and organizing, right? So if one of our members doesn't have regular access to food, that's not traditional organizing to figure out how they get more food. But if it means that that person is going to have the energy and the space to add to the momentum of the group, then it is our job as organizers to figure out how to get them more food, right? It is an interesting balance, but you also don't want to create a group where people are then just coming to you for direct service. Right? If everyone comes to you for case management and then just leaves, then you don't have organizing, then you're in direct service. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I have found it to be an interesting dynamic. There's lots of membership fluctuation and difficulty with recruitment because of serious issues. Right? When you're living day to day and you're just trying to put out fires, those fires are generally huge things. Custody battles, potential for eviction, loss of loved ones. Not that these don't happen to other people, but we are working with a population who's generally already more vulnerable. And so usually when they're missing meetings or changing their membership, it's for really serious reasons. And you can't just say, hey, could you just like put that on the back burner and come do the work with us? Absolutely not. They're in an experience where that's going to consume their whole life. Escalation can be really difficult. Like I mentioned, for a group like ours, most of the women are survivors of domestic violence. And so media campaigns are pretty limited because many of them do not want their face associated with the group, right? For very, very good reason. When we're talking about, we do some tenant-based organizing as a part of this group, to come and speak out against management is extremely risky because if you have nowhere else to go. So those things are really challenging. And also motivation. Organizing is 1 step forward, 8 steps backward most of the time. You spend a month preparing for a presentation. You spend the month before that cutting the issue, figuring out who has power, what's already been done, doing the research. And then you have the meeting and the person in power tells you, I'm not going to do anything. Or they tell you I'm going to do anything and it's going to take me 1.5 years to do it. How do you keep people motivated? It's a really tough thing and we're still working on it, is my answer. I don't have an answer for it. But the advantage to relational organizing is that you can sit down and talk about it, not pretend like, oh, we're just going to jump into the next level of escalation. We're going to sit down and be like, man, that was really hard. That hurt to hear. That was painful that that person didn't care. And so in that way, the personal level keeps things rolling. I wanted to end on a positive note because complexities of organizing is just like, why even do it? Because it's a beautiful practice. It's a beautiful thing to do. The reality is, and I think COVID is showing this more and more, our system is not working for most people. And I mean that at all levels of system. I mean the global system, the system in the US, it's not working for most people. Organizing brings up new answers because the history, especially in this country, is that people who are making the solution or making the toolkit of support are people who have never experienced poverty. So when you start to bring that in, there are answers. I have this experience all the time with the group, like almost every meeting. I realize, oh my God, I never would have thought of that because I've never experienced it. But that makes so much sense. But without being part of it, I never would have. So it's very, very innovative. It addresses narratives about people in poverty. So very often we have this us versus them. We have a country built on the idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And when you start to incorporate the stories of people who have been trying to do that or for whatever reason don't, you start to see where the little cracks are. And you start to see the things that we actually have more in common than we have as differences. Also sort of flips the switch on who has knowledge and what counts as knowledge. We're seeing that right now with COVID around people who are laborers with their hands, is turning out to be what we need, right, as support. And so same in organizing. When we just talk about, okay, the things we learn in school, no offense to school, I also have a master's degree. That's how I got into this. I love school. I'm doing academic research. I still work at Westminster. I'm part of the grad school there. in teaching, so I love academia, right? But there's been a really big imbalance of academic knowledge and experiential knowledge. And so organizing starts to integrate experiential knowledge in a whole new way. It also brings a prefigurative, you know that term? A prefigurative model. So we run our groups in the way that we want broader systems to work. We base it on horizontal leadership. It means lots of conversation and lots of discussion. And lots of navigating really, really hard things that often get relegated. Like, that's not politics, so we don't bring that into the political space. But really, really, none of us are existing in political spaces without our humanness, right? Without all the rest of us. So how do we bring that into the conversation? Bring levels of inclusion that often don't happen in political spaces. And then, like I mentioned, my particular area of interest is somatics. So how do we bring this connection between mind and body, which to me is part of what the narrative around what counts as knowledge, because if you're just focusing on your brain up here and not what's happening in your body, you're missing, for me, you're missing a really important piece of what it means to be human and what it means to know. I just have, oh, it's not gonna go there. We're frozen again. Am I sharing the screen? Oops, will let me do it? There we go. Now we're on a different thing, but this is our logo. We just ask at the end of every presentation will you join us, not necessarily specific our group, but as you know, in community organizing, there's lots of ways to get involved. There's also lots of ways to support it in other capacities, or you don't have to be directly organizing. If you're working with folks cut on the tail end, like folks interested in more in clinical and therapy, you know, supporting, because that's a really important part of creating a space for people in their own bodies and their own minds to be able to enter sort of community organizing spaces. This is our logo. One of the moms drew it. We love it. We think it represents pretty much who we are. The power of being a woman, being a mom, you know, strapping a baby to your back, holding a bottle, and going to do the rest of life, and the power that that has, that is. That's what I have. Hope that was helpful. What questions do you have? Comments?
Jessica, this is Lexi. Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I really think that you brought a lot of the concepts that we've been learning down to earth, and you know, explained it in a way that makes sense, and it really shows, you know, the nitty-gritty of how this works. So we don't have too much time for questions, maybe 5 minutes. If anybody feels comfortable, you can ask your question verbally, or again, if you don't want to be in the video in any way, you can send me a quick text or email with your questions. So I'll give folks a minute or two to decide if they have a question and how they want to convey it.
Jessica, this is Scott. I did want to ask a question. First, I just want to say thank you for, you know, all your efforts out there. It's difficult, and also wanted to just let you know I agree that, you know, sometimes it feels that our system isn't working for most of us, and we do see that today probably more than we've seen it in a long time, just in our current crisis. And I want to maybe challenge you a little bit. I'm going to ask a difficult question. I want to ask you about your philosophy, within your philosophy, and what you mean exactly, because I do think that's an interesting piece, where you say that the people with experience, and maybe you can repeat it for me, but the people with experience know how best to help themselves. Is that what your philosophy, how it's said?
No, they know best ways to address the issue. So maybe not necessarily for themselves, like on their like individual level, especially I say once they have time to separate a little bit, right? Like, one of the reasons that organizing, the group came out of a survey that we did of families in the Midvale Family Shelter in the YWCA and at Palmer Court. And the reason that Palmer Court is sort of what stuck initially is because organizing homeless folks is really hard because they are so deeply entrenched in the issue that they don't have that opportunity to sort of like come up for air and say like, okay, having gone through that or still going through it, but with a little more stability, this would be really helpful.
Yeah. I guess I really appreciate what you said about listening and also to what, listening to what's said, but also more importantly, maybe what's not said and trying to find out, because I think that's the piece that I think is so difficult to do in organizing, is marrying our experience with their experience, or merging the knowledge of how to move through systems, or with the feedback. And I know that sometimes it sounds nice on paper to say that they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but so often we find out that it's not. So I guess my question is, in your experience, how do you find that you can overcome those two things, those barriers, which is they can't help themselves maybe in the short term, but they do have the knowledge or they do have the experience to help find the actual solutions that need to be discussed in order to solve those problems?
Question. It's a challenge, a very big challenge. One of the ways that I have found this is an answer, is through that listening. So when they are feeling like the listening and facilitation. So when we get into a space of, we can't do anything about it, I can't do this, I can't do this, or complaining, venting, right? A little bit is how we'd usually frame it. Being able to listen and pull out that like, wait, but like you had that solution right there. So I'm really grateful. I don't have experience in any sort of I have no therapy background, but I have gone to a lot of therapy in my life, and it's been really helpful. And one of the things I've actually learned from that, and one of the reason we brought the social work on, was to help facilitate in that way, to show people that even when, I think one of the biggest barriers to reaching whatever goal you have is a mental block of like, well, I don't think I have the tools. And you're like, actually, that was a really great idea that I heard. You said it, you framed it this way, but like, what if we framed it this way? And that's actually the solution to the problem. It's sort of like starting to draw that out. And some people are not in that place. And that's another challenge of organizing, is when you have new people come in and they're not in that place yet. How do you navigate that? I don't know if that's too vague, but is that kind of an answer?
No, I appreciate that. Great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Lexi here again. So I wish that we had more time, but I'm just mindful that the class is supposed to be ending about 2:30 here. So Jessica, thank you so much. That was invaluable to have you here, and really appreciate you being here despite the current situation that we're in. I hope that you would be willing to consider returning at some point if I have the privilege to teach this class again. It was just wonderful to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'm totally open. You get my email. I see there's another question in the chat. If you want to keep chatting about any of this stuff, literally I could talk about it forever, and I love peeling apart those really hard things. So yeah, reach out to me anytime if you want to.
Would you be willing for me to share your email address with the class? Okay.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'd love to chat with any of you. So thank you so much for all the work that you all do.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care.
You as well.